Every great leader I've interviewed, they never stop learning and they never stop questioning. And they're constantly seeking new perspectives and challenging their own assumptions. And I think a lot of times what you run across is when you see government executives who aren't getting their message out and they're doing a lot of good stuff and their mission is really successful, maybe it speaks for itself, or maybe somebody's getting in the way. And I think that's where you always have to make sure your team recognizes as the leader that we're here not to hide. We're here not to pretend. We're here to create clarity, to really honor the mission, that this is about public stewardship.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James Christian Blockwood. Today, we're exploring the intersection of media and public administration, two forces that shape how Americans understand their government, how public servants tell their stories, and how trust in institutions is built. To help us examine this evolving relationship, I'm joined by two thoughtful voices working at that crossroads. Michael Keegan, host of the Business of Government Hour at the IBM Center for the Business of Government, where he's interviewed hundreds of public sector leaders on management, innovation, and mission delivery. Dave Martin, host of the Good Government podcast, which elevates stories of public servants and sheds light on how government works behind the scenes. Michael, Dave, welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.
You've both interviewed so many public servants across agencies and levels of government. From your vantage points, what do they have in common? Are there shared traits, motivations, or mindsets that consistently show up in the people who choose to serve? Dave, let's start with you.
Sure. As you know, it's called the Good Government Show. And so what I do is I talk with people about good government. And for the most part, across the board, the people I talk to are there because they want to serve. They want to make their city better, their county better, their state better, their country better. They are really, truly dedicated public servants. And I could go through some of these folks, but the first guy that comes to mind is David Vela. He was former head of the National Park Service. This guy, all he ever wanted to do was work for parks. And his entire career, he just was impressed with the jobs that he had, the places where he was working, and what he was doing in his service to the nation. And I think no matter whether you're a county commissioner or whether you're the head of the Park Service, most of the people I talk to they want to help.
Michael, you just heard Dave say service to the nation and outlined a few characteristics. What have you come across in the guests that you've interviewed?
I've done so many interviews over the year, James Christian, and it strikes me, I recall a senior federal executive who I spoke to, and I never forgot this. It was one of the first interviews I did, and he said, Michael, leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about creating a room where the smartest thinking happens. When I think about that, I think of the privilege of talking to DepSecs and agency heads, and military leaders, scholars, authors. One thing that I notice is that they have a fundamental desire to lead, and that the fundamentals that Dave talked about, leadership, to building that public trust, working for the public, those qualities don't change, though the context absolutely changes. And right now, what I'm seeing is government's operating in the most complex context we've ever seen in generations.
I think that provides a lot of context to the conversation we're going to have here. I can't help myself. I've got two of the largest voices in the space of promoting public servants. You both have shows that take the incredible accomplishments of those working really hard on behalf of the American people, and you highlight that for everyone. What's the best public service story you've come across on your own show? Or maybe someone else's, but something tells me it's going to be on yours.
There are so many. I don't know. I'm going to try to narrow it down to a few. I already talked about David Vela, the former head of the Park Service. One of the first stories I ever did was with Christian Lineback in Berks County, Pennsylvania. That's Reading, Pennsylvania. They have something called the R3 program. These two women were in charge of the court intervention program, and it wasn't working. And they literally both got a cup of coffee. They sat down at their desk and they said, what are we doing wrong? And they realized they didn't need a 2-week program. They needed an 8-week program. And they got the recidivism rate down, a 65% national average, down to 5%. And this was just two women. They didn't get bonuses. They didn't get a big raise. They didn't get a promotion or anything like that or their name in the paper. But they came up with a program that allowed people who might be going to jail not to go to jail and to learn the art of construction and how to work. Just so impressed with that. There's one other woman I want to mention. There's several I can mention. Stop me anytime. Becca Bixler lives in a town called Inwood, Iowa. She said, why don't we have a walking trail here? And they said, because no one's actually tried to get it And she walked in wanting a walking trail. She walked out with an application to run for city council. She ran for city council. They did get the walking trail in, and then she became mayor. And she's a really excellent example of something that all people I ask, I have a questionnaire and I ask people, what would you like people to know about government? And what would you like people to do if they don't like what they're seeing in government? And the answer was get involved. She got involved. She got what she wanted. She helped her city, and now she's the mayor. And I really want to mention one other guy, Oz Nesbitt. He's a former county commissioner in Rockdale County, which is Augusta, Georgia. And just the show I did with him was just a masterclass in leadership. This guy was a police officer. He was a basketball coach. He's a deacon at his church, and he's a Toastmaster. And he said, David, you got to listen to this. You got to avoid the three ugly E's. Those are emotion, ego, and entitlement. He goes, you got to avoid the three ugly E's or you're going to wind up in jail. And then he added to that, what saved my life with the three A's, that's attitude, approach, and appearance. The guy always walks out of his house in a suit. I could go on, but I'll stop now and let Michael take over.
The one that I want to talk about is somebody I think is dear to your heart, and that's my last interview with Gene Dodaro. It was 50 years at GAO. What made him distinct wasn't his longevity to me. It was his ability to balance consistency with adaptability. And when I interviewed him, what struck me most was how intentional he was about everything he did. He told me in his last interview, he met with the chairs and ranking members of every congressional committee to understand their priorities. He maintained relationships with all branches of government throughout his time at GAO. And he understood that being effective requires being trusted by people across the political spectrum. And I think it was 3 times I've interviewed Gene during his tenure. And this last one, as he was exiting, was the most powerful one because it showed me he was absolutely unwavering about values, integrity, accountability, and nonpartisanship. And those never change. But he did underscore this: methods do. It's always fascinating when you talk to Gene approaching retirement, and he's learning. He's still learning. And his priority was building a personal legacy. And that was one for the U.S. government. The other one I really like is I went over to Amsterdam to interview Erwin Rademacher, who is the program manager for the Port of Rotterdam. And he offered a fascinating perspective on multi-sector collaboration with a distinctly outside the U.S. perspective. He talked about the triple helix: government, industry, and academia working in genuine partnership. And he said when they stopped thinking, and this always stuck with me, when they stopped thinking about contractors and started thinking as co-creators, they were able to do this first-rate digital twin and just create a port, the Port of Rotterdam, for the next generation. It's an amazing story.
Michael, you're absolutely right about Mr. Dodaro and his intentionality. And being someone who's worked directly for him and has spent a considerable amount of time under his leadership, I also want to comment on one thing that you probably see in him, but in many of the guests that you interview, is the investment in other people. He was incredibly intentional in being a mentor and sharing his knowledge with others. Can you tell me, are there other people that you've come across that fit that model of leadership that you've interviewed? And of course, their story is very powerful, but it's also what they've said to uplift others around them.
Yeah, another person I got to speak to several times over their career, and it was a long career. In a similar vein to Gene was Dave Liebrick, who prior to his retirement was the fiscal secretary of the United States and Treasury. And at one point, Dave actually did do acting roles as the Secretary of Treasury. And he spent, like Gene, he spent his entire career, I believe, at Treasury, 30 years. And when I interviewed him, we talked about the pandemic response and how it compared to the Recovery Act response of 2008. And what struck me, James Christian and Dave, was how he framed the work. Dave Liebrick said that financial management isn't, and this is key, isn't accounting, it's strategy. And that every budget decision is a value decision. Every financial system is a delivery mechanism for mission. And that building relationships and creating the structure for his team at Treasury to trust each other and work together collaboratively made them successful with the pandemic distribution of trillions of dollars. And one thing Dave underscored with me was that his team delivered because of decades of preparation, because of relationships built over years, and because of systems they had put in place and strengthened incrementally. he actually shared a story with me real quick about how when they were told to get the money out for the pandemic response, they needed EBT cards. They needed basically debit cards, and they needed a lot of them. And there was no vendor that wasn't out there on the market, so to speak, but they had a relationship with a vendor that they built over years. And he did a favor. He did right by them, and he found like something on the order of 30 million cards that really helped. That building that relationship and working years to build that together with his team illustrates what it means to put people first.
Dave Liebrick, Gene Dodaro, two fellows of the Academy, but also two very good examples of public servants. Now, public service isn't always visible to the American public. You all, of course, know a lot of the stories and you help tell them. But how do you think storytelling through podcasts or other media really help bridge the gap between what government actually does and what the public thinks government does? Dave, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
So just quickly, my background, I started off as a newspaper reporter, and then I switched to working in television news at both the local and network level. And the sad thing here is the people are not buying a newspaper every day anymore like they used to. And I think that having a podcast is an essential way for everyone to get their message out and to be able to tell a story and to tell a story that the way they want to tell it. And unfortunately, I think we don't all pick up the Washington Post if you're in Washington every day for lots of different reasons, but for lots of different reasons. So that's why I think podcasting is essential. And I think what we're trying to do on our show anyway is I want people to listen to the show and go, oh, that's what government does? That's a good thing. They should do that. That's where government's spending our money. That's money well spent. And like one person I mentioned that we're having on the show is coming up soon is Danny Werfel, who's the former head of IRS, everyone's favorite government agency and a Academy Fellow. You know, you talk to him and you go, you know what? The IRS is a pretty cool organization. Because what he said, and I had somebody else who was an IRS agent on, they want you to pay exactly what you're supposed to pay, no more, no less. No more, no less. And if you have a problem with it, they'll help you. I think nobody really thinks of the IRS as a partner, but as a Danny, what's it like when you go to cocktail parties and you tell people, yeah, I'm head of the IRS, and he had an answer for that. There's a lot of people, I think, who work in government, and when you hear about what government does, I had Craig McLean on. He was the chief scientist at NOAA, and his whole passion was weather and telling weather and science and making sure that the air and water was clean, explaining what that does. And when you listen to him talk, you're like, wow, that's really cool.
Michael, how do you think about closing that gap?
It's a great question, because when I interview a government executive or even an author, I'm asking them some standard, I always have in the queue standard questions. And one of those questions, especially with the government executive, is what advice would you give to someone who is thinking about a career in public service? The advice usually is the best answer for connecting what government does and how it impacts the listener's life. And I almost wanted to do a show where I culled together all of those responses from varying government executives, where they basically say, hey, we do this, our mission is X, your investment matters, and we're actually making a difference in your lives. And that's why public service matters. And it really does underscore what Dave said earlier, that when you can make something that seems unapproachable, like IT modernization, and you say, that's going to get you your benefit quicker. It's just without you having to do anything, potentially. It just brings it home what government actually can do when it's effective. The other thing I wanted to say, if I could, what I try to do also to make some of the conversations we have around leadership with government executives is I try to tap into the arts, movies, and books, and try to draw out. I did an essay with David Mamet's book, True and False. He was talking about actors and what the art of acting is, and it's not technique, it's truth. It's being authentic. And that translating into government leadership is really, you have to be authentic as a leader, or people will smell it and the mission will fail. And I just did a recent one on taking David Lynch's The Straight Story and extracting leadership lessons from The Straight Story, from the main character, Alwan. And I think those are the ways, both from the voices of the government executives on the front lines, and also bringing in maybe other artifacts. There are ways that you could communicate the importance of public service and public administration and leadership, and it doesn't seem so ethereal.
I want to jump on something he said when you talk about arts. We've done 2 or 3 stories about libraries, which is just the greatest example of public service and use of government dollars.
Great point.
This is a government entity. And I went and talked to the Fairfield County head librarian, and we just talked about all the things that you do in libraries. And you don't really think of libraries as government, but it is the best example of government serving the people, through a library.
Let me backtrack a little bit. I heard a lot of good information about people and leadership and all of the contributions they're making. And it makes me think about what's the qualities of the people you're talking about. They're thoughtful. They're very good storytellers, even if they don't have the classical training behind that. They are really telling their story through their own lens and doing it in a compelling way. But that's on the backdrop of really listener or a broader audience that listens for sound bites. They somewhat perpetuate partisanship. Sensationalism generally rules the day, and they have shorter attention spans. You both bring these stories to light, but you do it in a way that's interesting, a way that it avoids the politics of the issue. How do you do that? How do you tell the story in a way that resonates with people, keeps their attention, but also avoids creating any partisanship or division? How do you do that?
Yeah, we started this with the idea that we were going to talk about good government. That was our focus. And we really weren't going to talk about politics at all, and we were going to try to avoid it as much as possible. So the answer to your question is, I have no idea. I have to make it up with every single show. I just remember I was talking to this one guy, and he was just going on and on about somebody at the national level who I totally disagreed with. I'm like, okay, please get on with it. Please get on with it. Please get on with it. And then he told me about this great program where they basically pick up high school kids and they show them government. They show them county government. And I was like, oh, that's good government. That's a great project. So I put aside the other thing and I picked that up. I guess I try to do that. There was a guy I was talking to in rural West Virginia, and they had a windmill. And he said, oh, we have the first windmill. I was like, oh, this is fantastic. And he goes, yeah, get rid of it. Get rid of it. And I was like, why? You're in coal country. You're having to switch from a coal-reliant economy. And there was a voice in the back of my head saying, stop this. Don't do this. Don't do this. This isn't helpful. And I just switched topics. Ultimately, politics is one thing and government is another thing. It's serving the people. It's making sure people's lives are better. And one of the things that I'm sure you all have heard more than I is when there's a pothole in your road, they don't care if the mayor has an R or a D next to his name. They want the pothole filled. So we try to stick with that.
And Michael, what's your strategy?
It's a great point. As you well know, James Christian, the IBM Center produces the show, The Business of Government Hour. And the IBM Center's mission is if you look at public administration or public policy, the legislative side, sausage-making side, is what's done on the Hill. And it tends to be the politics, the political propaganda, the narrative, if you will. And our focus has always been on the implementation side, the management side. And this has been going on. The show has been on for over 25 years, as long as the center's been around. And that single thread of mission focus, mission execution, implementation, as Dave pointed, fill that pothole, make life better for people. It's very conversational. But one of the things I feel bad about lately is not talking to my guests in person. Prior to COVID, I used to have 42 shows with government executives, C-suite, DepSecs, and they'd come and see me. They'd come into our studio and we would chat. To answer your question more directly, how do I make it interesting for people? I let the principals speak for themselves. I always tell the people that I talk to, I'm a conduit. This is about you talking to the audience. I'm merely asking the questions that they might want to know the answer to. It's not a gotcha conversation. I always say this is educational and informational. I'm telling people, I'm hoping to tell people stories about the work you're doing that can give them a foundation to understand what that mission is for that department, that agency. And then they can be better informed and go back and say, Bob Smith, Barbara Smith, they said X, but they're not really doing Y. That's not my conversation. I'm trying to give them the tools to understand the basics and maybe to be aspirational in terms of being more educated towards something.
Government isn't always good about talking about itself or highlighting its accomplishments. If people knew even half of how public servants really every day work hard on their behalf and the things they contribute to make sure they have better lives, we probably would have an overall better view of government more broadly. So you two are masterful communicators. What's the advice you would give an agency leader in how they communicate, or someone who's being asked to tell their story about being a public servant and how they might communicate to an audience?
First, they should always come on my show and be a guest whenever I ask them. But I think, and this is the hard part, right? When I started off, I was in the Florida City Reporter, and I had to go to every Florida City, Florida town hall meeting, and sometimes I was the only guy there. And so it's real hard to get your message out, but you got to get it out. You got to fire on every cylinder. You got to do the social media, whether you like it or not. You got to try to still get in the local news, and you got to try to get on local print and national news. You got to fire on all cylinders. There's no one magic bullet. It's not you got a story in the local paper the next day and everybody read it. Doesn't happen anymore. So you have to just be relentless and fire everywhere.
Every great leader I've interviewed, they never stop learning and they never stop questioning. And they're constantly seeking new perspectives and challenging their own assumptions. And I think a lot of times what you run across is maybe when you see government executives who aren't getting their message out and they're doing a lot of good stuff and their mission is really successful, maybe it speaks for itself, or maybe somebody's getting in the way. And I think that's where you always have to make sure your team recognizes as the leader that we're here not to hide. We're here not to pretend. We're here to create clarity, to really honor the mission that, let's be honest, this is about public stewardship. And if you can tell that story and tell it well and never think that you have all the answers and that you're basically putting yourself out there, you're putting yourself out there as a leader when you go on one of our shows and you're telling people exactly what you're doing for them. And if you're being honest about it, you're also telling them about where you're failing and where you hope to be successful going forward and what's going to be needed to do that. And it reminds me of a great line. It was one of Mamet's books, and it's "Let us learn acceptance." And what he's talking about, in this case with actors, is accepting failure as part of the process. And leaders can create the culture where failure is seen as a stepping stone to success and not a career-ending event. When I try to get folks on the show, booking is probably one of the most demanding parts, especially in this environment. And I often I'm telling the people, the gatekeepers, you need to let your principal come out and speak, tell their stories, and make sure that people understand the mission of your agency, the public trust you are instilled with, and how you're trying to achieve that mission. And I think that's all you can do is offer them that platform.
Yeah. Dave, my last question to you, let's think about the untold story or the stories that are not really talked about and don't get a lot of visibility. Let's give it some visibility right now. What's one of those stories that you believe should be heard by everyone, repeated by everyone, and maybe isn't right now, but because you're going to tell us about it, more people are going to know why it's so important and what impact it could have?
I've come across a lot of people that have done some really incredible work, and you go, why didn't I know about that? There was a county commissioner, Mary Alford in Alachua County, which is Gainesville. They have something called the Citizens Academy, where they take people through every department of the county government, and they get to learn what it's all about. Most of the people, when they graduate, they go on to serve either in city council or they go run for elected office or they work on local boards. That's really impressive. I've spent way too much time in West Virginia. I can't spend enough time in West Virginia, really. And I've really got into the changes in the coal community and the coal economy. There's a company called Appalachian Botanical that put a lavender farm on a former strip mine, and they put people back to work. There's a guy named Greg Puckett, who's a county commissioner. They're taking down one dilapidated house at a time. They really have boosted tourism in West Virginia. You think, oh, tourism, West Virginia, really? Seriously? The nation's newest national park is New River Gorge, and they've done a lot of work out there, and people are coming in. There's a woman named Tara Stamps in Cook County, which is Chicago. She has this thing called Shop Talk, and what they did is they've got a sort of a crisis intervention program in local barber shops aimed at young boys, teenage boys, to see if they are having problems, but they've got They bring the services out to the neighborhood. Toni Preckle is a legend. She's the president of the Chicago Board of Commissioners. She came up with a program where they eliminated medical debt. One of the great guys I talked to is a guy named Gino Moretti, who's a mayor in Canada. He said something really interesting. The water doesn't know borders. So we can do a great job in Canada, but if you're not doing a great job in the United States, it doesn't matter, which is why the Erie County Executive has started a water initiative, a pure water initiative. There's so many great programs going on, and I talked about libraries before, but if you really scratch the surface, and you don't really have to scratch that hard, you'll find that in most communities and most states and most agencies, there's a really incredible program there. Again, with that mission of how can we make your day better? How can we make your life better?
At the Academy, we have a Celebrating the American Public Servant initiative because we understand the power in storytelling, and we hope to uplift the stories of public servants to the nation more broadly, to inspire those to serve in the future, but also to really just recognize that the daily lives of Americans are impacted so greatly by our public servants. When media helps illuminate the stories of those people, the public gets a clearer, more accurate picture of the government that serves them. Michael and Dave, thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you both for the work you do in highlighting the people that keep government moving.
Thank you.
Thank you, James Christian.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.